Now, the purpose of the Bible is to testify of Jesus Christ. The Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, points to Christ.
The Bible is true in a very strange way. What you do as an educated person is sample that structure that constitutes the sum total of the texts of our civilization.
Because if those four things are true, that there's truth, that God exists, that miracles are possible, and the New Testament is reliable enough to let us know that the resurrection occurred, then Christianity is true. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity is true.
So, what is the food you give to the soul? It is reading the Bible, the Word of God. And I don't care who you are, you cannot live a victorious life if you neglect Bible reading and Bible study.
But what we have at stake here is far more than that. You know, your life depends on this book. So read it.
Pulpit Commentary explains, verses 1 through 21, the Song of Moses. Full of gratitude, joy, and happiness, burning with a desire to vent in devotional utterance of the most fitting kind, his intense and almost ecstatic feelings, Moses, who to his other extraordinary powers added the sublime gift of poesy, composed, shortly after the passage, a hymn of praise, and sang it with a chorus of the people as a thanksgiving to the Almighty. The hymn itself is generally allowed to be one of transcendent beauty, deriving probably the general outline of its form and character of its rhythm from the Egyptian poetry of the time, with which Moses had been familiar from his youth. It embodies ideas purely Hebrew, and remarkable for grandeur, simplicity, and depth. Naturally, as being the first outburst of the poetical genius of the nation, and also connected with the very commencement of the national life, it exerted the most important formative influence upon the later Hebrew poetic style, furnishing a pattern to the later lyric poets, from which they but rarely deviated. The parallelism of the members, which from the middle of the last century has been acknowledged to be the only real rhythmical law of Hebrew poetry, with its three forms of synonymous, antithetic, and synthetic or verbal parallelism, is here found almost as distinctly marked as in any of the later compositions. At the same time, a greater lyrical freedom is observable than was afterwards practiced. The song divides itself primarily into two parts. The first, verses 1 through 12, retrospective, celebrating the recent deliverance. The second, verses 13 through 18, prospective, describing the effects that would flow from the deliverance in future time. The verbs indeed of the second part are at first grammatical preterites, but, as Kalish observes, they are, according to the sense, futures, their past form, denoting only that the prophet sees the events revealed to him as though they were already accomplished. Hence, after a time, he slides into the future. Verse 16. The second part is continuous and has no marked break. The first subdivides into three unequal portions, each commencing with an address to Jehovah, and each terminating with a statement of the great fact that the Egyptians were swallowed up. These three portions are: 1. Verses 2 through 5, the Lord is my strength. 2. They sank into the bottom as a stone. 2. Verses 6 through 10, thy right hand, O Lord, 2. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. 3. Verses 11 and 12, who is like unto thee, O Lord, the earth swallowed them. The first verse stands separate from the whole, as an introduction, and at the same time as the refrain. Moses and a chorus of men commenced their chant with it, and probably proceeded to the end of verse 5, when Miriam, with the Hebrew women, interposed with a repetition of the refrain. See verse 21. The chant of the males was resumed, and carried to the close of verse 10, when again the refrain came in. It was further repeated after verse 12, and once more at the close of the whole song. Similar refrains, or burdens, are found in Egyptian Melodies Part 1, verse 1. Then sang Moses and the children of Israel. It is in accordance with the general modesty of Moses that he says nothing of the composition of the song. No serious doubt of his authorship has ever been entertained, but the general belief rests on the improbability of there having been among the Israelites a second literary genius of the highest order, without any mention being made of him. The joint singing by Moses and the children of Israel implies the previous training of a choir, and would seem to show that the Israelites remained for some days encamped at the point which they had occupied on quitting the bed of the sea. He hath triumphed gloriously. Literally, he is gloriously glorious. The horse and his rider, rather, the horse and his driver. Chariots, not cavalry, are in the mind of the rider. Verse 2. The Lord is my strength and song. Literally, my strength and song is Jah. The name Jah had not previously been used. It is commonly regarded as an abbreviated form of Jehovah, and was the form generally used in the termination of names as Abijah, Ahaziah, Hezekiah, Zedekiah, Mount Moriah, etc. It takes the place of Jehovah here, probably on account of the rhythm. He has become my salvation. Literally, he has been to me for salvation, i.e., he has delivered me out of the hand of Pharaoh and his host, and so saved me from destruction. I will prepare him a habitation. This translation seems to have come originally from the Targum of Onkelos, who paraphrases the single word of the text by the phrase, I will build him a sanctuary. The meaning is a possible one, but most modern commentators prefer to connect the verb used with a root meaning beautiful, and translate, I will glorify him, the God of my father. See the comment on Exodus 3 verse 6. Verse 3. A man of war. A strong anthropomorphism, but one that could scarcely be misunderstood. A man of war, meaning commonly a warrior, or one mighty in battle, from Psalm 24 verse 8. God's might had just been proved, in that he alone had discomfited and destroyed the most potent armed force in the whole world. The Lord is his name. Jehovah, the alone existing one, truly describes him, before whom all other existence fades and falls into nothingness. On the full meaning of the name, see the comment on Exodus 3 verse 14. Verse 4. Pharaoh's chariots and his host. The host of this passage is not the army of Exodus 14 verse 9, though in the original the same word is used, but the whole multitude of those who rode in the chariots, and were drowned in the sea. Hath he cast, or hurled? The verb commonly expresses the hurling of a javelin, or the shooting of an arrow. His chosen captains, compare Exodus 14 verse 7, are drowned. Literally, were submerged. The word describes the act of drowning, not the state of lying drowned in the depths of the sea. Verse 5. The depths have covered them, rather covered them, into the bottom. Literally, into the abyss, like a stone. The warriors who fought in chariots commonly wore coats of mail, composed of bronze plates sewn onto a linen base, and overlapping one another. The coats covered the arms to the elbow, and descended nearly to the knee. They must have been exceedingly heavy, and the warrior who wore one must have sunk at once, without a struggle, like a stone, or a lump of lead. Verse 10. Verses 6 through 18. Between verses 5 and 6, Miriam's chorus was probably interposed, sing ye unto the Lord, etc. Then began the second strophe, or stanza of the ode. It is, in the main, expansive, and exegetically of the preceding stanza, going into greater detail, and drawing a contrast between the antecedent pride and arrogance of the Egyptians, and their subsequent miserable fall. Verse 6. Thy right hand, O Lord. Another anthropomorphism, here used for the first time. Compare ver. 12 Deuteronomy 33 verse 2 and the Psalms pass him. Is become glorious or is glorious. Kalish rightly regards verses 6 and 7 as containing a general description of God's omnipotence and justice, and notes that the poet only returns to the subject of the Egyptians in verse 8. So also noble hath dashed in pieces. Rather, will dash in pieces, or dashes in pieces a general statement. Verse 7. Thou hast overthrown, etc. Here again the verbs are future. Translate thou wilt overthrow. Or thou overthrowest them that rise up against thee, thou wilt sendest forth thy wrath, which consumes them as stubble. The metaphor in the last clause was one known to the Egyptians. Verse 8. With the blast of thy nostril the waters were gathered together. Poetically, Moses describes the east wind which God set in motion as the blast, or breath of his nostrils. By means of it, he says, the waters were gathered together, or piled up then, growing bolder in his imagery. He represents the floods as standing in a heap on either side, and the depths as congealed. No doubt, if these terms are meant to be taken literally, the miracle must have been one in which the sea, as Kalish says, giving up its nature, formed with its waves a firm wall, and instead of streaming like a fluid, congealed into a hard substance. But the question is, are we justified in taking literally the strong expressions of a highly wrought poetical description? Verse 9. The enemy said. This verse is important as giving the animus of the pursuit, showing what was in the thoughts of the soldiers who flocked to Pharaoh's standard at his call, a point which had not been previously touched. It is remarkable as a departure from the general stately order of Hebrew poesy, and for what has been called its abrupt, gasping style. The broken speech imitates the utterance of one at once eager and out of breath. I will divide the spoil. The Israelites, it must be remembered, had gone out of Egypt laden with ornaments of silver and of gold, and accompanied by flocks and herds of great value. Pharaoh's soldiers regarded this wealth as legitimate plunder and intended to appropriate it. My lust, literally my soul, rage and hate were the passions to be satiated rather than lust. My hand shall destroy them. So the Vulgate, Onkelos, Rosenmuller, Noble, Kalish, and others. The Septuagint have kappa upsilon iota epsilon sigma epsilon iota. Acquire the lordship over them, whence our marginal rendering, but the drawn sword points to death, rather than recapture. Verse 10. Thou didst blow with thy wind. Here we have another fact not mentioned in the direct narrative, but entirely harmonizing with it. The immediate cause of the return of the waters, as of their retirement, was a wind. This wind must have come from a new quarter, or its effects would not have been to bring the water back. We may reasonably suppose a wind to have arisen contrary to the former one, blowing from the northwest, or the north, which would have driven the water of the bitter lame southward, and thus produced the effect spoken cf. The effect may, or may not, have been increased by the flow of the tide in the Red Sea. They sank as lead. See the comment on verse 5. Verses 11, 12 contain the third stanza of the first division of the ode. It is short compared to the other two, containing merely a fresh ascription of praise to God, cast in a new form, and a repetition of the great fact which the poem commemorates: the Egyptian overthrow. We conceive that Miriam's chorus ver. 21 was again interposed between verses 10 and 11. Verse 11. Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? It was one great object of the whole series of miraculous visitations whereof Egypt had been the seeing that the true God, Jehovah, should be exalted far above all the gods of the heathen. See Exodus 7 verse 5, Exodus 14 verses 4 and 18. Moses therefore makes this one of his topics of praise, and at the same time notes 3 points in which God has no rival: first, holiness; second, awfulness; and third, miraculous power. Compare Psalm 86 verse 8, among the gods there is none like unto thee. O Lord, neither are there any works like thy works. Fearful in praises, i.e., to be viewed with awe even when we praise him. Verse 12. Thou stretchedst out thy right hand. Thou hadst only to stretch out an arm, and at once thy enemies perished. The earth swallowed them up, i.e., the sea, which is a part of the earth. Part 2. Verse 13. Thou in thy mercy hast led forth, or leadest forth. See the introduction to the chapter. Which thou hast redeemed. See the comment on Exodus 6 verse 6. Then hast guided, or thou guidest. Thy holy habitation. By God's holy habitation some understand Mount Sinai, others Canaan, others Mount Moriah, or even the temple there to be built ultimately. That Sinai is not intended seems clear from verses 14-15, where the nations mentioned are such as were untouched by the occupation of that mountain. Canaan might sufficiently answer the requirements of the present verse, but scarcely comes up to those of verse 17. Altogether, it is clear that Moses knew there would be a place in the land of Canaan where God would put his name. Deuteronomy 12 verses 5 and 11, 14 Deuteronomy 14 verses 23 and 24 Deuteronomy 16 verse 6, 11 Deuteronomy 26 verse 2, etc., and it would seem to be not unlikely that he may have known where the place would be by special revelation. Verse 14. The people shall hear, rather, the peoples, i.e., the tribes or nations of these parts, Philistines, Amalekites, Edomites, Moabites, etc., will hear of the wonders done in Egypt, especially of the crowning wonder of all Israel's passage through the Red Sea, and Egypt's destruction in it, and will in consequence tremble with fear when the Israelites approach them, and offer them no effectual opposition. Palestine. This is a Greek form. The Hebrew is Phelesheth, which would perhaps be best translated Philistia. Compare Psalm 60 verse 8, Psalm 87 verse 4, Psalm 108 verse 9. The Philistine country was a strip of territory extending along the coast of the Mediterranean, from a little below Gaze on the south, nearly to Mount Carmel on the north. It is curious that the Philistines are not mentioned under that name on any of the early Egyptian monuments. They may perhaps be the Perusia of the time of Ramesses III, whom some however identify with the Pelasgi. Verse 15. The dukes of Edom. Compare Genesis 36 verse 15. By the time that the Israelites approached the borders of Edom, the dukes had given place to kings. Numbers 20:14. And everything like abject fear of Israel had passed sway. The Edomites came out against Moses with much people and with a strong hand, and refused to allow the Israelites passage through their borders. Verses 20-21. The mighty men of Moab. The alarm of the Moabites was indicated by Balak's efforts to induce Balaam to curse the Israelites. Numbers chapters 22, 23, and 24. By their mighty men some understood men of unusual strength and stature cook, but the expression, which is very frequent both in the prophetical and the historical books, seems to be a mere periphrasis for warriors. All the inhabitants of Canaan shall melt away. This prophecy received a remarkable accomplishment when it came to pass that all the kings of the Canaanites heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan from before the children of Israel, and their heart melted, neither was there spirit in them any more. Joshua 5 verse 1. Verse 16. Fear and dread shall fall upon them. Compare Deuteronomy 2 verse 25, Deuteronomy 11 verse 25. The Edomites of Mount Seir and the Moabites gave Israel a free passage through their borders, Deuteronomy 2 verse 4 through 8, and 18 as well as 29, being afraid to oppose them. To like people pass over, O Lord. Some see in this an anticipation of the crossing of Jordan. But perhaps Moses meant no more than the crossing of the Canaanite frontier. In some place or other, which must take place if the area was to be occupied. The event made the expression used peculiarly appropriate. When thou hast purchased. By bringing his people out of Egypt, their ownership had passed to him from the Egyptians, just as if he had bought them. See Exodus 6 verses 6 and 7, Exodus 19 verse 5. Verse 17. Thou shalt bring them in Ai, give them possession of the Lod, and plant them Ai. Fix them firmly in it, enable them to take root there. The mountain of thine inheritance. The land of Canaan, which is almost wholly mountainous, and which God had given as an inheritance to his people, Genesis 15 verse 7, Hebrews 11 verse 8. The sanctuary. See the comment on verse 13. Which thy hands have established. Moses sees an idea, the sanctuary already set up, and God dwelling in it, and emphasizes his conviction by using the past tense. Verse 18. In terms most simple yet most grand, often imitated Psalm 10 verse 16, Psalm 29 verse 10, Psalm 146 verse 10, etc. But never surpassed, the poet gives the final result of all God's providential and temporary arrangements, to wit, the eternal establishment of his most glorious kingdom. And here reaching the final consummation of all things, 1 Corinthians 15 verse 28. He will not weaken the impression made by adding another word, but ends his ode. Verses 19 through 21. Sequel to the song. The sequel treats of two quite separate masters. 1. It asserts, in verse 19, the historic groundwork of the song, reiterating in a condensed form the three principal facts of the presage already recorded in chapter 14. A. Israel's safe transit across the seabed. B. The pursuit attempted by the Egyptian chariot force. And C. The return of the waters upon the pursuers by God's providential action. 2. It relates, in verses 20 and 21, the part taken by Miriam in the recitation of the ode, which has been noticed in the introduction to the chapter. Verse 19. The horse of Pharaoh, with his chariots and with his horsemen. Rather, with his chariots and with his chariot men. Compare Exodus 14 verse 23. The Lord brought again the waters of the sea upon them. See Exodus 14 verses 26 and 27 and Exodus 15 verse 10. The waters did not merely return to their natural place when the east wind ceased to blow, but were brought back by miraculous power and with abnormal rapidity. Verse 20. Miriam, the prophetess. Miriam is regarded by the prophet Micah 6 verse 4 as having had a share in the deliverance of Israel, and claims the prophetic gift in Numbers 12:2. Her claim appears to be allowed both in the present passage and in Numbers 12:6-8, where the degree of her inspiration is placed below that of Moses. She is the first woman whom the Bible honors with the title of prophetess. Prophetesses were common in Egypt at a much earlier date, and thus that a woman should have the gift would have seemed no strange thing to the Hebrews. For examples of other prophetesses, see Judges 4 verse 4, 2 Kings 22 verse 14, Isaiah 8 verse 3, Luke 2 verse 36. The sister of Aaron. Compare Numbers chapter 26 verse 59. Miriam is generally regarded as the sister of Moses mentioned in Exodus 2 verse 4-8, whose name is not there given. If so, she was considerably older than either Moses or Aaron. Took a timbrel. By a timbrel our translators meant what is now called a tambourine. Such instruments were common in Egypt, according to Wilkinson, Ancient Egyptians, Volume 1, page 93, and in the representations are generally played by women. The separation of the men and women into distinct bands was an Egyptian custom, as likewise was the execution of dances by performers, who accompanied their steps with music. Verse 21. Miriam answered them. Miriam, with her chorus of women, answered the chorus of men, responding at the termination of each stanza, or separate part of the ode with the refrain, "Sing ye to the Lord," etc. See the introduction to this chapter. While responding, the female chorus both danced and struck their tambourines. This use of dancing in a religious ceremonial, so contrary to Western ideas of decorum, is quite consonant with Oriental practice, both ancient and modern. Other examples of it in Scripture are David's dancing before the ark, 2 Samuel 6 verse 16. The dancing of Jephthah's daughter, Judges 11 verse 34, and that of the virgins of Shiloh, Judges 21 verse 21. It is also mentioned with approval in the Psalm 149 verse 3 and 4. Dancing was practiced as a religious ceremony in Egypt, in Phrygia, in Thrace, by the Phoenicians, by the Syrians, by the Romans, and others. In the nature of things there is clearly nothing unfitting or indecorous in a dedication to religion of what has been called the poetry of gesture. But human infirmity has connected such terrible abuses with the practice that the pure religions have either discarded it or else denied it admission into their ceremonial. It still, however, lingers in Mohammedanism among those who are called dancing dervishes, whose extraordinary performances are regarded as acts of devotion. Verses 22 through 27. The journey from the Red Sea to Elim. After a stay, which cannot be exactly measured, but which was probably one of some days, near the point of the eastern coast of the Gulf of Suez, at which they had emerged from the seabed, the Israelites, under the guidance of the pillar of the cloud, resumed their journey, and were conducted southwards, or southeastwards, through the arid tract, called indifferently the wilderness of Shut, verse 22, and the wilderness of Etham, Numbers 33, verse 8, to a place called Marah. It is generally supposed that the first halt must have been at Ain Musa, or the springs of Moses. This is the only green spot near the passage over the Red Sea, according to Cook. It possesses at present 17 wells, and is an oasis of grass and tamarisk in the midst of a sandy desert. When Wellsted visited it in 1836, there were abundant palm trees. It does not lie on the shore, but at the distance of about a mile and a half from the beach, with which it was at one time connected by an aqueduct, built for the convenience of the ships, which here took in their water. The water is regarded as good and wholesome, though dark-colored and somewhat brackish. From Ain Musa, the Israelites pursued their way in a direction a little east of south through a barren plain where sand storms are frequent, part of the wilderness of Shur, for 3 days without finding water. Here their flocks and herds must have suffered greatly, and many of the animals probably died on the journey. On the last of the 3 days water was found at a spot called thenceforth Marah, bitterness, because the liquid was undrinkable, after the miracle related in verse 25, and an encampment by the side of the sweetened spring, from Numbers 33 verse 8. They proceeded onward without much change of direction to Elim, where was abundance of good water, and a grove of 70 palm trees. Here they encamped by the waters, and were allowed a rest, which probably exceeded a fortnight. See the comment on Exodus chapter 16. Verse 1. Verse 22. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. There is no such connection between this verse and the preceding narrative as the word so expresses. Translate, and Moses brought. The wilderness of Shur, called also that of Ethan, Numbers 33 verse 8, appears to have extended from Lake Sarbones on the north, across the isthmus to the Red Sea, and along its eastern shores as far as the Wadi Garundal. It is almost wholly waterless. And towards the south, such wells as exist yield a water that is bitter in the extreme. 3 days. The distance from Ain Musa to Ain Hawara, the supposed representative of Mara, is not more than about 36 miles. But the day's march of so large a multitude through the desert may not have averaged more than 12 miles, and found no water. No doubt the Israelites carried with them upon the backs of their asses water in skins, sufficient for their own wants during such an interval. But they can scarcely have carried enough for their cattle. These must have suffered greatly. Verse 23. And when they came to Mara. It is not clear whether the place already bore the name on the arrival of the Israelites, or only received it from them. Mara would mean bitter in Arabic no less than in Hebrew. The identification of Mara with the present Ain Hawara, in which most modern writers acquiesce, is uncertain from the fact that there are several bitter springs in the vicinity, one of them even bitterer than Hawara. We may, however, feel confident that the bitter waters of which the Israelites would not drink were in this neighborhood, a little north of the Wadi Garundal. Verse 24. And the people murmured against Moses, as they had already done on the western shores of the Red Sea. Exodus 14 verses 11 and 12. And as they were about to do so often before their wanderings were over. See below, Exodus 16 verse 2, Exodus 17 verse 3, Numbers 14 verse 2, Numbers 16 verse 41, Deuteronomy 1 verse 27, etc. Murmuring was the common mode in which they vented their spleen when anything went ill with them. And as Moses had persuaded them to quit Egypt, the murmuring was chiefly against him. The men who serve a nation best are during their lifetime least appreciated. What shall we drink? Few disappointments are harder to bear than that of the man who after long hours of thirst thinks that he has obtained wherewith to quench his intolerable longing, and on raising the cup to his lips, finds the draught so nauseous that he cannot swallow it. Very unpalatable water is swallowed when the thirst is great. Ethan, page 197. But there is a limit beyond which nature will not go. There may be water everywhere, yet not a drop to drink. Verses 25 and 26. The Lord shewed him a tree. Several trees or plants belonging to different parts of the world are said to possess the quality of rendering bitter water sweet and agreeable, as the Nelamaram of Coromandel, the sassafras of Florida, the yerba coniani of Peru, and the Perinelli or Phyllanthus imblica of India. But none of them is found in the Sinaitic Peninsula. Burckhardt suggested in Travels in Syria, page 474, that the berries of the Gurkha peganum retusum, a low thorny shrub which grows abundantly round the Ain Hawara, may have been used by Moses to sweeten the drink, but there are 3 objections to this. First, Moses is not said to have used the berries, but the entire plant. Second, the berries would not have been procurable in April, since they do not ripen till June, and third, they would not have produced any such effect on the water as Burckhardt imagined. In fact, there is no tree or shrub now growing in the Sinaitic Peninsula which would have any sensible effect on such water as that of Ain Hawara, and the Bedouins of the neighborhood know of no means by which it can be made drinkable. Many of the fathers believe that the tree had no natural effect, and was commanded to be thrown in merely to symbolize the purifying power of the cross of Christ. but to modern such a view appears to savor of mysticism. It is perhaps most probable that there was some tree or shrub in the vicinity of the bitter fountain in Moses' time which had a natural purifying and sweetening power, but that it has now become extinct. If this be the case, the miracle consisted in God's pointing out the tree to Moses, who had no previous knowledge of it. The waters were made sweet. Compare the miracle of Elijah, 2 Kings 2 verses 19 through 22. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance. See the next verse. God, it appears, after healing the water and satisfying the physical thirst of his people, gave them an ordinance, which he connected by a promise with the miracle. If they would henceforth render strict obedience to all his commandments, then he would heal them as he had healed the water, would keep them free at once from physical and from moral evil, from the diseases of Egypt and the diseases of their own hearts. And there he proved them, from the moment of their quitting Egypt to that of their entering Canaan. God was ever proving his people, trying them, that is, exercising their faith and patience and obedience and power of self-denial, in order to fit them for the position which they were to occupy in Canaan. He had proved them at the Red Sea, when he let them be shut in between the water and the host of the Egyptians. He proved them now at Marah by a bitter disappointment. He proved them again at Meribah, Exodus 17 verse 1 through 7, at Sinai, Exodus 20 verse 20, at Taberah, Numbers 11:1 through 3, at Kibroth Hattaavah IB, verse 34, at Kadesh IB 13:26 through 33, and elsewhere. For 40 years he led them through the wilderness to prove them, to know what was in their heart, Deuteronomy chapter 8, to fit them for their glorious and conquering career in the land of promise. All these diseases. See Deuteronomy 7 verse 15, Deuteronomy 28 verse 27. Kalish correctly observes that, though the Egyptians had the character in antiquity of being among the healthiest and most robust of nations, Herod, chapter 2, 77, yet a certain small number of diseases have always raged among them with extreme severity. He understands the present passage of the plagues, which, however, are certainly nowhere else called diseases. There is no reason why the word should not be taken literally, as all take it in the passages of Deuteronomy above cited. Verse 27. They came to Elim. Elim was undoubtedly some spot in the comparatively fertile tract which lies south of the wilderness of Shur, intervening between it and the wilderness of Sin-Now-e-1 Merkah. This tract contains the 3 fertile wadis of Garundel, Uziat, and Tavi, each of which is regarded by some writers as the true Elim. It has many springs of water, abundant tamarisks, and a certain number of palm trees. On the whole, Garundel seems to be accepted by the majority of well-informed writers as having the best claim to be considered the elm of this passage. 12 wells, rather springs. The 12 springs have not been identified, but the Arabs are apt to conceal the sources of their water supplies from Nibur, Arabi. Page 347. A large stream flows down the Wadi Garundel in the winter time, which later becomes a small brook, from Burkhard, Syria, page 778, and dries up altogether in the autumn. The pasture is good at most seasons, sometimes rich and luxuriant. There are abundant tamarisks, a considerable number of acacias, and some palms, 70 palm trees. The palm trees of this part of Arabia are not like those of Egypt or of pictures, but either dwarf, that is, truntus, or else with savage hairy trunks and branches all disheveled, according to Stanley, Sinai and Palestine, page 68. There are a considerable number in the Wadi Garundel, and others in the Wadi Tabi. They encamped there. it has been observed that the vast numbers of the host would more than fill the Wadi Garundal, and that while the main body encamped there, others, with their cattle, probably occupied the adjacent wadis Uziat, Ethel, and even Tabi or Shuika, which all offer good pasturage